Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of lymphatics. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the cells of the lymphatic system. So there are a number of different types of lymphatic cells, and they're found in different parts of the lymphatic and our circulatory system, as well as some of the resident cells in the tissues. So if you remember way back to like the second week of class, there were certain types of resident cells that were always found in the tissue. These can be lymphatic cells as well. So some examples of lymphatic cells, we have macrophages, macro meaning big, phage meaning eating. So these are cells that are big eaters, right? They're capable of phagocytosis. They can grab bacteria or cellular debris and they can gobble it up. Thymic nerve cells, these are cells found in the thymus that help other cells of the lymphatic system develop. We have dendritic cells. So in this case, dendrites, the dendro, right, means branching. So these cells have many, many branches. They're not part of the immune system, but they have many, many processes, many branches that they use to talk to a number of different cells. And dendritic cells tend to act as communications hubs for the immune system, right? So they help facilitate communication. And the last type we have are lymphocytes. And remember, a lymphocyte was a particular class of leukocytes, if you remember that from our blood section. So inside leukocytes, inside white cells, you had your neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes. Now we're looking at the lymphocytes, and there are actually three major groups of lymphocytes. So all these cells are lymphocytes. So the first are T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. T lymphocytes are important for cellular toxicity and for activating the immune system. We'll talk about that in a second. B lymphocytes will eventually turn into cells that make antibodies. And natural killer cells, the name implies, they go around and kill other cells. But they're a little bit different than the cytotoxic T lymphocytes. So I will point that out. Now, all of these cells are capable of moving around the body and looking for a particular antigen. Remember, an antigen is a compound that provokes an immune response. These cells will respond to a specific antigen and help deal with a particular threat to the body. Now, far and away, the most common type of lymphocyte are the T lymphocytes. So they make up about 80% of the lymphocytes in the body, and they have a very special protein on their surface. Actually, they have many proteins, but the important one we're going to talk about is the CD receptor, a CD protein. What CD stands for it's not compact disc. It stands for cluster of differentiation. You don't need to know that, but in case you wondered what CD stands for. Now, there are different versions of CD depending on what type of T cell you have. So one of the main groups of T cells are helper T cells. Helper T cells. Their job is to help coordinate and control the immune response. Second type of T cell is called cytotoxic T cell. So a cytotoxic T cell is toxic to other cells, so it can attack and kill other cells. So I mentioned this, that CD is important. So helper T cells have what's called CD4. It's just a particular version of the CD protein. So helper T cells have the CD4 receptor, or it's actually a co-receptor. This is not an immunology class, so I'm not going really deep. I'm just trying to introduce the main players here. So if you notice me being a little bit technical about some terms, it's because I'm trying to not say anything that is technically incorrect. But I guess what I'm saying is don't sweat when I make the distinction between a receptor and a co-receptor. If you're understanding studying immunology, that's really important. It would be a mistake to confuse those two, but for our purposes in anatomy, don't worry about it. Okay, T helper cells have CD4, and their job is to oversee the immune response, right? So the language that these cells are going to use are a language of chemicals. So what we call cellular chemicals for communication over short distances are called cytokines, cyto meaning cell. So a cytokine is a chemical signaling molecule used over short distances. It's the job of the T cells to use cytokines to activate or control the rest of the immune response. So one thing I do want to point out here of why these T cells are so important is your immune system is incredibly powerful. Your immune system needs to be very tightly controlled. If you guys have ever heard of anaphylactic shock, so that would be an allergic reaction that happens so quickly that you die within minutes, right? Some people are, super allergic to bee stings or cosmetics, and if, they get a bee sting, they could die. Well, that is actually due to the immune system. Anaphylaxis is your own immune system doing so much damage, it's going to lead to a catastrophic drop in blood pressure, and that's how you die of anaphylactic shock. So your immune system can kill you within minutes if it's activated in an uncontrolled fashion. So we obviously don't want that to happen. So there is a method of controlling the immune system, whereas all the parts of your immune system are set to off. They're turned off in order to avoid an inappropriate response that would kill you within minutes. So the immune system is set to off unless it is very specifically and intentionally turned on, right? Turned on a little bit at a time so you get a stronger and stronger response. That way you match the amount of force the immune system is using to the threat that's present. Because if you just went right to 11 at the very beginning, you would do far more harm than you actually would do good. So one of the major players in controlling that level of activation of the immune system are T helper cells. Now, cytotoxic T cells have a different CD receptor. They have what's called CD8. So when you use these terms, CD8 positive T cell, CD4 positive T cell, it's the exact same thing as saying cytotoxic T cell. So CD8 positive T cell, cytotoxic T cell, for our purposes are more or less equivalent. We'll just leave it at that. For our purposes, they're more or less equivalent. T helper cell, CD4 positive cell, same for our purposes. So the job of the cytotoxic T cell is when they are activated by CD4 T cells, they will use their receptor to recognize specific antigen and then attack cells. They can attack foreign cells and they can also attack your own cells. And you might say, why would I want my T cells attacking my own cells, right? That seems crazy. If you think about it for a second, it makes sense. If you're suffering from a viral infection, theoretically, at any rate, a single viral particle gets inside one of your cells. It can replicate itself millions of times. One virus in, like a million viruses out. That is really bad mathematics. So if that cell cannot fight off that viral infection, it will signal nearby cytotoxic T lymphocytes to come and actually destroy the cell, right, in a controlled fashion that prevents the release of all those viruses. Preventing a million viruses from being released from the death of one cell, cell's going to die anyway, but if a T cell takes it out, you can avoid the release of all those viruses, and it helps stop the spread of the infection. So that's a good trade. Now, I should say there are other types of T cells. There's something called T regulatory cell. This is not something I'm going to test you on, but those have interesting functions. They can actually turn the immune system off, and they play an important role in things like, why doesn't the mother's body initially attack the fetus? It's a genetically distinct foreign life form growing inside your body, right? Your immune system should attack. One of the reasons that it doesn't are these special kinds of T cells called T regulatory cells. If you want to learn more about that, maybe take microbiology or take an immunology class. I just thought it was an interesting thing to mention. So these figures are so general that they can be a little bit unhelpful. But let me just talk through what this figure is trying to show. So what this figure is trying to show that CD4 positive or T helper cells, they will encounter antigen. Let's just leave it at that. And then what they will do is they will expand their population, so they'll undergo mitosis, and they will start secreting cytokines. So one T cell with its one receptor gets activated by encountering antigen. It then increases its number by mitosis, and then all those daughter cells start producing cytokines, and those cytokines can do things like stimulate the production of antibodies or activate cytotoxic T cells, or they might do things like activate other leukocytes to help fight off the infection. So the T helper cell has to be aware that there's foreign antigen, be aware that it needs to respond, increases its numbers, secretes chemical signals called cytokines to activate other cells of the lymphatic system to help fight off the infection. So it's controlling the activity of other cells. Now, what this is simply showing is a simpler interaction between a cytotoxic T cell and the target cell. Say it's a cancer cell, right? Your body wants to destroy cancer cells. If you have a virally infected cell, it's going to want to destroy those cells, or perhaps a foreign cell. So here, the CD8 receptor, along with some other important receptors, are going to recognize antigen on the surface of the foreign cell. Cytotoxic T cell will then attack and kill the foreign cell. There's lots more to it, but let's just keep it at that for now. Next type of lymphocyte are B lymphocytes. And these are pretty common, making up about 25% of the lymphocytes. Now what they do, they have special receptors, and when they become activated, they will produce antibodies, right? So another word for an antibody is an immunoglobulin. Immuno meaning having to do with your immune system, and globulin because these are globular proteins. So B lymphocytes are activated by T helper cells. So T helper cell learns there's a problem, activates the B cell. The B cell, once it's activated by the T helper cell, turns into something called a plasma cell. Now, a plasma cell is different than a B cell because B cells don't actually make antibodies. When they're turned into plasma cells, then they do make antibodies. In fact, a plasma cell is nothing but an antibody factory. They only live for like 2-3 weeks, and their job is to just pump out as much antibody as they possibly can. And after you recover from your disease, the plasma cells usually all die away. Now, there's one other possible fate for an activated B cell. Some B cells, once they get activated by the T helper cell, were turned into memory B cells. So what these cells do, they do not become plasma cells. What they do is they remember that they were activated, and then they hang out in your various lymphatic tissues. What happens is the second time you see that antigen, the second time you're infected by that same pathogen, these cells respond extremely quickly. Normally, for a T cell to be activated, which activates a B cell, which then makes an antibody, that whole process usually takes about 10 to 14 days. That's why most illnesses don't really last more than about a week to a week and a half. Because once your lymphocytes are activated, once your B cells and T cells are activated, these are the big guns of your immune system, and you usually recover. Now, if you get reinfected by the same pathogen and you have memory cells, and by the way, you can have memory B cells and memory T cells, you don't have to go through the 7 to 10 day process to activate these cells. As soon as they see their antigen, they wake up and they attack. So what can happen is, if you try to get reinfected by a pathogen that you've already survived, that you've already developed an immune response, if you have these memory cells, they will activate and suppress the infection before you even know you're sick. Have you ever had the experience of waking up in the morning and feeling, I don't feel so good, and your glands are swollen? Maybe you have some swelling in your neck, or swelling in your armpits, or in your groin. Well, in the neck, armpits, and groin, you have lots and lots of lymphatic tissues, lymph nodes, and that's where these memory cells hang out. So when you wake up, you're tired, you're groggy, you're a little bit sore. Often what that is these memory cells becoming activated, increasing their numbers, and doing their thing, right? You never actually develop a full-blown illness, but you do feel a little crummy for a day, maybe two, because your memory cells are kicking into action, but you don't actually have to go through the entire disease process again, thanks to these memory cells. So this is just showing the process by which memory cells and plasma cells are generated. Cytokines are released by the T helper cell. Right? The T helper cell's cytokines interactions with the B cell causes the B cell to become activated. You will generate plasma cells, which are simply antibody factories. So remember, an antibody is an immune protein that fights off infection. It can do lots of things, but it helps fight pathogens. A certain small percentage of those will be memory B cells. These do not make antibody, but what they do is they move off into the lymphatic tissues of your body, like lymph nodes in the neck, arm, and groin, and they hang out 10, 15 years until the next time you're infected by that pathogen, and then they wake up very quickly divide into plasma cells and make a huge amount of antibody and suppress the infection before it ever begins. This is the reason why grandmas don't get very many colds, because they've lived a long time. They've raised their own children. They were a child, so they got sick. They generated memory B cells from that. They had kids themselves. Those kids got sick, made her sick, so she generated more memory B cells from that. And now she's taking care of the grandkids, which bring in more viruses, so she gets sick more, generates more B cells. So the longer you live, the more B cells you generate, the less likely you are to be infected by sort of the common cold that comes around. Now, obviously, when you get old enough, your immune system starts to fall off, and you will lose the immunity that you've collected over a lifetime. So there is, a point where it doesn't really work all that well. But you may have noticed in your own family, right? Maybe the whole family's got a cold except for grandma, and that's because she's been around a long time, and she's got a lot of memory B cells, a lot of memory T cells that help keep her safe. Okay, so the last type of lymphocyte are natural killer cells, and these are very interesting cells, and we really can't get into them. But they have a different type of CD protein, and they're called they have a CD16. So not CD8, not CD4, they have CD16. So the reason these are called natural killer cells is because they can recognize a very wide range of antigen. Typically, B cells and T cells will only recognize one antigen. That's it, one antigen out of like hundreds of millions. But natural killer cells can recognize many different kinds of antigen. And they're super important for the suppression of cancer. So all of us are generating precancerous cells all the time. It's just part of living. It just happens. Natural killer cells, among other mechanisms, remove those cells from the body so we don't actually develop cancer, don't actually develop a cancerous growth. So there's a great deal of research going on to better understand how natural killers work, to educate a patient's own natural killer cells and try and redirect them at attacking cancers in the body. So a very active study of research. They're very difficult to understand. Go take an immunology class and you'll talk lots about natural killer cells, and it's really kind of cool. But here, I just wanted to point out it's a type of lymphocyte. They express CD16. They recognize many different types of antigens, and they're very important for fighting off all kinds of infection and actually preventing cancer. So this is a very nice little table. Like this kind of information on this table, this is what I would expect you to be able to take away from the class. So be aware of all this information. Good stuff here. So how are these cells made? Well, it's by a process called lymphopoiesis, right? Which is part of hematopoiesis, which we talked about in our section on blood. So lymphopoiesis is just the specific development of lymphatic cells. Now, when these cells are first created, they are not active, they're not functional, they can't really protect us. They need to fully develop. The process of these lymphatic cells becoming fully developed is called immunocompetent. So immunocompetent means the cells are ready to do their job of protecting the body from invasion. So all lymphocytes are going to originate in red bone marrow, but some of them take different pathways to immunocompetence. Some of them go to different parts of the body for maturation. So here we have a vertebra, right? Axial skeleton. You're going to have red bone marrow throughout your life. You're going to have our hematopoietic stem cell, right? There were the two lines that we talked about in blood, the lymphoid line. So some of those lymphoid line are going to end up becoming T cells. T cells, during the maturation process, leave the red bone marrow and they travel to the thymus. That's why T cells are called T cells, because they go to the thymus for maturation. So there in the thymus, there are thymic nurse cells, which will help support and help the development of T cells in the thymus. Once they're fully developed in the thymus, they will actually leave the thymus and start populating the other lymphatic tissues of the body. So the way this works, immature T cells are first created in the red bone marrow. Then they move to the thymus, where they become immunocompetent. Once they're immunocompetent, they will leave the thymus and enter lymphatic tissues, things like lymph nodes throughout the body, and there they wait and protect us from infection. Now, there's a little strange fact here. The thymus is the only organ that decreases with age. After, I think, about 13 years of age or somewhere in that, the thymus actually simply shrinks in size because so many T cells are leaving it and no new ones are coming in that the whole organ gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So from the time you're a baby until I think you're like 10 or 12 years old, the thymus grows with you, but after that, it actually gets smaller and smaller. So if anyone had ever seen heart surgery on a child, when they open up the chest, the thymus covers almost the entire heart. It's a really large organ. But you crack open the chest of an adult, and it's this tiny little thing sitting on top of the heart. So fun fact, the only organ that shrinks with age. So that's the path that T cells take. T cells leave the bone marrow and go to college at the thymus. B cells, on the other hand, and natural killer cells, do not leave the bone marrow. They stay in the bone marrow for maturation. So I told you that T cells are called T cells because they mature in the thymus. And you might think that B cells are called B cells because they mature in the bone marrow, but it's actually not true. Believe it or not, when this mechanism was first understood, it was discovered in chickens, and chickens have another lymphatic organ called a bursa. And in chickens, immature B cells travel to the bursa to become activated, and then they travel throughout the body. It just so happens that bone marrow and bursa both start with B's. So if you remember B cells, B for bone marrow, if it works, great. That gets you the right answer to know where B cells mature. But one of the reasons I mention this is a discovery where T cells go, where B cells go. It was actually made by a graduate student many years ago, but impressive that a student could make a major contribution to the understanding of how the immune system functions. So I like pointing that out. And that brings us to the end of part 2. After this, we'll start talking about lymphatic nodules, lymphatic organs, and some of the specific structures that we'll see. So catch you next time. Take care.